every now and again, we get a vulnerability that's been found in a piece of open source software that's existed for a long time, and hasn't been reported, at least
more often these days.
Yeah, at least not reported by someone committed to responsible disclosure. We saw that in the past with Shell Shock, right, which was 25 years old when it was discovered. The bug had been in the code since 1989. If we fast forward to October this year, there was a bug announced in SQLite that had existed for 22 years, going all the way back to the year 2000 when the code was added. That made me think of three things, really. That the first one, that open source software we used to say was more secure because more people were looking at it all of the time, and I don't think that's necessarily true, right? The whole many eyes makes it secure doesn't seem to ring true anymore. Look at Shell Shock and SQLite. I think it shows us how SBOMs, software bill of materials, will make it easier for, at least for vendors and consumers, to understand whether or not the vulnerable thing is in the software that they're evaluating. It's not necessarily going to make it easier to understand whether the piece of software is in your estate, but at least in the piece of software you're looking at right now.
Makes me that makes me question SBOM. Now, is that going to the software build of materials, right? Is that going to impact open source projects in the same way that it will with vendors? That's one thing I know I didn't ask you when we talked about SBOM last month.
That's a good question, and actually, so my gut says no. It's really mostly going to affect vendors. Obviously, most vendors consume a lot of open source software, but at least, it's a good question. There are some large open source projects that consume other open source projects.
Absolutely.
And do they have like a de facto SBOM because they're open source? Or are those projects going to have to create a specific SBOM? They're open source, so you could just answer, just look at the code. Much like, are there any vulnerabilities?
It honestly might be easier for some of them to do so if they, because the dependencies are probably pretty well understood, and with the open source, you get an easier path to traceability, I think. But I'm reasonably certain that there are quite a few open source projects out there that have essentially local copies of like hyper-specific versions of some other open source code in them that has not been revved.
Yeah.
Right. So there are definitely some issues there. It's not as simple as just saying, well, look at the code. I think there's going to be some, that may be what people say originally, but I think there's going to definitely be some work in that. Yeah.
There was a paper that came out about a year ago, I think, and it was published by Veracode, and it was sort of their state of open source security. And I found it around this time last year when we were all fire drilling over Log4j. And it was actually a really, really amazing paper. It was a collaboration between Veracode and the Scientia Institute. And they quantified a lot of this stuff, and it was fascinating to see. It was like a little bit of good news, a little bit of bad news. I want to say it was the Veracode. I think it was SOSS, like the state of open source or something like that, volume 11. So if anybody wants to kind of know a little bit more about some of the quantitative research in this thing, it was a super cool paper.
You mentioned Log4j, Sander, and that makes me think, SBOM is a great solution for what libraries does this product contain, but it's not a great solution for where do these things all exist in my network, right? Log4j, there's millions of them all over the place in all sorts of stuff. And that extends further out than just libraries like Log4j. It's, how many elk stacks do I have deployed in my organization? Where are these all living that people have spun up over the years to consume data?
Not only that, but the first thing I thought of when I read about this was, man, I got to call my old employer. we used back in my ops career, we used a whole lot of SQLite for maintaining, large user structures, essentially. Wow, that's terrifying. That was less than 22 years ago. So,
well, isn't SQLite often used in a sort of embedded fashion, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So right there, it's a patching nightmare. How many different versions of this do we have deployed? How many different? Yeah. So.
Yeah, on thousands of servers across multiple generations, and oh man,
I think I actually have a little bit more hope for SBOM in open source, right? Because I don't know a ton about it, but you see more and more sort of SBOM vendors popping up, and everybody sort of wants to help you solve this solution by baking you into an ecosystem with a dashboard that's going to tell you about it, and I just my gut says we're going to see some sort of thing where two different SBOM vendors are going to have a different data model, and therefore there's going to be slippage between them, or version problems, or a new vuln. You know what I mean? It's like I would like to think that the open source community can actually implement this better. You were talking there earlier, Aaron, about the many eyes are supposed to make it secure, and it's one of these things where like you can come up with an aphorism or a sort of proverb that goes in either direction. Because you could also just say that this is like the tragedy of the commons thing, right? And which one we end up with, the tragedy of the commons or the many hands make better soup, essentially boils down to like how active the community is, right? If they're organized and they communicate about it ahead of time, and people are keep their brain oriented around this, open source can do way better. And if it is more like, oh, I'm sure someone else is locking down that code, I'm sure someone else is scanning that, then we're going to have a problem, right? But I would like to believe that SBOM can thrive in this space.
Yeah, I think our pals over at Lo-Fi Gang are all over that, actually. And hi, guys. By the way, guys. Yes. So actually, it's funny. Well, go ahead, Aaron.
I was going to say the last thing that this makes me think, every time this happens, talking about open source especially, I think, it's great that we found out about this thing, right? And with Log4Shell and with the SQLite vulnerability, they're disclosed, and then we see, especially with Log4Shell, wide-scale exploitation attempts, right? Because it's disclosed, there's a proof of concept, and it was something that you could easily just spam across the internet.
Mm-hmm.
One day,
clearly,
if it hasn't, if it hasn't already happened, we're going to discover something like this that's existed for 20 years in some core piece of code that's deployed across millions of devices, and we'll realize that someone already has been quietly exploiting it for 20 years, right? That's the terrifying one for me. And we've just, we didn't know where to look. We didn't know how to see the IOCs. And all of a sudden, any boxes that you've ever seen popped where you've just thought, I just don't know how someone got in there. We'll know, right?
20-year-old bootkit.
Yep.